reading room. This is Dr. Annette Feravich, doctor in health and positive psychology, not one of those stupid MDs driven by the lust of their ignorance. Yeah, that's right. Love for their ignorance. Hey, let's read a book that kind of shows us what we're talking about. This is by Rene Descartes. It's French. And it's translated by Richard Kennington. This is from the first section, and the first section is Natural Imperfection and Human Longing. This is chapter number 2, Scientific Aspirations. And yeah, this one is by Rene. It is an excerpt from Discourse on Method by Rene Descartes and translated by Richard Kennington. In 1636, the great French philosopher scientist Rene Descartes, I'm saying that wrong, published 3 scientific treatises, the Dialectics, the Meteors, and his world-shaking geometry, the last providing the basis for all modern mathematical physics. As a preface to these 3 treatises, Descartes wrote his famous Discourse on the Method of Conducting One's Reason Well and Seeking Truth in the Scientist, popularly known as the Discourse on Method. In this discourse, Descartes presents a synopsis of his entire philosophical system in the form of a 6-page autobiographical history or fable, 2 excerpts of which are presented here. In the first, taken from part 1, Descartes gives an account of his early education, indicating why he rejected all book learning and nearly all then existent sciences. Their teaching were either uncertain or useless or both. This desire for certain and useful knowledge led him to devise a method that would yield such knowledge, a method that combined elements of the previously distinct sciences of arithmetic and geometry to form what we today call analytic geometry. Part 2, not reproduced here. Armed with this new mathematics, Descartes then shows how it could lead to an entirely new science of nature, physics, one devoted not to discovering the nature of things, but to describing precisely all the material changes that undergo in terms of laws formulable as equations. Part 5, not reproduced here. In the second excerpt from the beginning of part 6, Descartes, in a famous passage, tells the reader why he publishes, despite the great danger that he might, in doing so, run afoul of the Inquisition, the Catholic Inquisition. He has discovered knowledge very useful in life, practical knowledge that could enable us to become like masters and possessors of nature. Such mastery, Descartes predicts, will enable us to satisfy all basic needs without toil, to conserve health, to make men wiser and more capable, and even to conquer the infirmities of age. In a word, to lift the curse which, according to Genesis, was laid on Adam and Eve, and to regain the tree of life by means of the tree of scientific knowledge. What moves the soul of Descartes? What is the demand for certainty, for utility? Is there some connection between these motives and the insistence on methodical knowledge? Is there some connection between these motives and the goals of mastery and possession of nature? Can we have certain knowledge about the questions that we are inclined to ask, even about the natural world and about human beings? Who stands to benefit from the new practical science? What is the implied relationship between the scientist and the broader society? Part 1. I was nourished in letters from childhood, and because I was persuaded that by their means one could acquire a clear and assured knowledge of all that is useful for life, I had an extreme desire to learn them. But as soon as I had finished this whole course of studies, at the end of which one is customarily received into the ranks of the learned, I changed my opinion entirely, for I found myself embarrassed with so many doubts and errors that there seemed to me to have been no other benefit in trying to instruct myself except that I discovered more and more my own ignorance. And yet I was in one of the most celebrated schools of Europe, where I thought there must be some learned men, if there were any, in any place on earth. I had learned there all that the others there had learned, and not being content with those sciences that they taught us, I had even looked through all the books treating of the most curious and unusual things that had fallen into my hands. Moreover, I knew the judgments others made of me, and I did not see that I was esteemed inferior to my fellow students, although there were already some among them destined to fill the places of our masters. And finally, our age seemed to me as flourishing and as fertile in good minds as any of the preceding. Therefore, I took the liberty of judging all others by myself, and of thinking that there was no doctrine in the world such as I had been led to hope for. I did not, however, cease to respect the exercises which occupy one in the schools. I knew that the languages that we learn there are necessary for the understanding of ancient books, that the gratefulness of fables awakens the mind, that the memorable actions of histories elevate it, and if they are read with discretion, they help to form the judgment, that the reading of all good books is like a conversation with the finest men of the past ages, who are their authors, and even a studied conversation in which they unfold to us only the best of their thoughts, that eloquence has incomparable powers and beauties, that poetry has most enchanting refinements and sweetness, that mathematics has very subtle discoveries which have great service, whether for contenting our curiosity or for facilitating the arts and reducing human toil, that the writings which treat of morals contain many teachings and exhortations to virtue which are very useful, that theology teaches us how to get to heaven, that philosophy supplies a mean of talking plausibly about everything and of making one admired by the less learned, that jurisprudence, medicine, and the other sciences afford honors and riches to those who cultivate them, and finally that it is good to have examined them all, even the most superstitious and false, in order to know that their just worth and to keep from being deceived by them. But I believed I had given enough time to languages, and even to the reading of ancient books, to their histories as well as their fables. For conversing with those of other ages is almost the same thing as traveling. It is good to know something of the morals of different peoples in order to judge more sanely of our own, and not think that what is contrary to our modes is ridiculous and against reason, as those who have seen nothing usually do. But a man who employs too much time traveling finally becomes a stranger in his own country, and when he becomes too curious about things practiced in past ages, he ordinarily remains very ignorant of those practiced in this one. Besides which, fables make us imagine many things as possible which are not, and even the most faithful histories, if they do not change nor augment the value of things in order to render them more worthy of being read, at least almost always omit the most base and least illustrious circumstances, so that what remains does not appear such as it was, and those who regulate their morals by the examples they draw from them are likely to fall into the extravagances of the knights errant of our romances, and to conceive purposes that surpass their powers. I held eloquence in high esteem, and I was enamored of poetry, but I thought that both were gifts of mind rather than fruits of study. Those who have the strongest reasoning capacity and who best digest their thoughts in order to make them clear and intelligible are always the best able to persuade others of what they propose, although they only speak low Breton and have never learned rhetoric. And those who have the most agreeable conceits, and who know how to express them with the most adornment and sweetness, would not fail to be the best poets, although they are ignorant of the poetic art. I was above all pleased with the mathematical sciences because of the certitude and evidence of their arguments, but I did not perceive them true usage, and thinking they were only of service to the mechanical arts, I was astonished that since their foundations were so firm and solid, nothing more exalted had been built on them. On the other hand, I composed the moral writings of ancient pagans to splendid and magnificent places built only on sand and mud. They exalt the virtues of the heights and make them appear more estimable than everything in the world, but they do not sufficiently teach how to know them, and often what they call by such a beautiful name is only insensibility or pride or despair or parricide. I revealed our theology and aspired as much as anyone to reach heaven, but having learned as an assured thing that the way to heaven is open to the most ignorant no less than the most learned, and that the revealed truths which led us there are above our intelligence, I would not have dared to submit them to the feebleness of my reasonings, and I thought that in order to undertake to examine them and to succeed, I would need to have some extraordinary assistance from heaven and to be more than a man. I shall say nothing of philosophy, except that seeing that it has been cultivated by the most excellent minds who have lived in many ages, and that nevertheless nothing is found in it which is not in dispute, and consequently which is not doubtful, I did not have enough presumption to hope for better success there than others. And when I considered that there can be diverse opinions about the same matter maintained by learned people without it being possible for more than one to be true, I regarded almost as false that which was only probable. Then as for this other sciences, insomuch as they draw their principles from philosophy, I judge that nothing solid could have been built on such infirm foundations, and neither the honor nor the gain which they promised was sufficient to incite me to learn them, for I felt that my situation, thanks be to God, did not oblige me to make a trade of science in order to alleviate my fortune. And although I did not make a profession of disdaining glory like the cynics, nevertheless I cared little for what I could hope to gain only by false titles. And finally, as regards evil doctrines, I thought I already knew sufficiently what they were worth, so as to not be deceived by the promises of an alchemist, the predictions of an astrologer, the impostures of a magician, or the artifices and the boasting of those who make a profession of knowing more than they do. That is why, as soon as age permitted me to escape the subjection of my preceptors, I gave up the study of letters completely, resolving to seek no other science but that which could be found in myself, or else in the great book of the world. I used the rest of my youth to travel, to look at courts and armies, to frequent people of diverse humors and conditions, to collect various experiences, to test myself in the encounters that fortune offered me, and everywhere to make such reflection on the things that presented themselves as would profit me. For it seemed to me that I could encounter much more truth in the reasonings that each man makes about the affairs that concern him, and whose outcome must punish him immediately afterwards if he has judged badly, than in those made by a man of letters in his study and speculation that produce no effect and which have no other consequence for him except insofar as he will derive more vanity from them the farther they are removed from common sense, because he will have had to employ so much more mind and artifice to render them possible. And I always had an extreme desire to learn to distinguish the true from the false in order to see clearly in my own actions and to walk with assurance in this life. It is true that while I did nothing but observe the morals of other men, I found scarcely anything there to convince me, and I noticed almost as much diversity in them as I had previously found in the opinions of the philosophers. So that the greatest profit I derived from this was that, seeing many things which, although they seem most extravagant and ridiculous to us, do not fail to be commonly received and approved by other great peoples, I learned not to believe anything too firmly, which had persuaded me only by example and custom. And thus I liberated myself little by little from many errors which may obscure our natural light and render us less capable of listening to reason. But after I spent several years in thus studying the book of the world and in trying to acquire some experience, I took one day the resolution also to study within myself and to use all the forces of my mind to choose the path that I should follow. I succeeded much better in this, it seems to me, than if I had never left either my country or my books. Interesting. That's interesting. For it seemed to me that I could encounter much more truth in the reasonings that each man makes about the affairs that concern him and whose outcome must punish him immediately afterwards if he has judged badly. So he's saying, I just want to talk to ordinary people because they know what they know. They know what they have observed, and there is real knowledge there. Very interesting. For it seemed to me that all right. Than in those made by a man of letters in his study of speculations that produce no effect and which have no other consequence for him except insofar as he will derive more vanity from them, and the farther they are removed from common sense, because he will have had to employ so much more mind and artifice to render them probable. That is the thinking of our pharmaceutical companies. That's the thinking of our mental health. Human trafficking component of what's going on. So there are no consequences to the pondering of philosophical matters when you are learned because of your arrogance. That's basically what he's saying. Okay, this is then part 6. So we read of his 6-part, part 1, and then part 6. It is now 3 years since I completed the treaty that contains all these things and began to review it before putting it in the hands of the printer, when I learned that certain persons to whom I defer and whose authority over my actions is scarcely less than that of my own reason over my thoughts had disapproved of a certain opinion in physics published shortly before by someone else, Galileo. I do not wish to say that I agreed with it, but since I had noticed nothing in it before their censure which I could imagine to be prejudiced to religion or to the state, or consequently which could have prevented me from writing it if reason had so persuaded me, this made me fear that there might be found among my thoughts someone which was mistaken, despite the great care I have always taken not to receive new ones among my beliefs, or of which I did not have very certain demonstrations, and to write nothing which could turn to the disadvantage of anyone. This sufficed to compel me to change the resolution that I had taken to publish them, for although the reasons for it that I had previously taken were very strong, my inclination, which had always made me hate the trade of producing books, immediately made me find enough other reasons to excuse me from it. And these reasons on both sides of the matter are such that not only do I have some interest in stating them, but perhaps the public will also have some in knowing them. I have never made much of the things which came from my mind, and so long as the only fruits of the method I used were in satisfying myself regarding certain difficulties that belong to the speculative sciences, and in trying to regulate my morals by reasons that it taught me, I did not believe that I was obliged to write about it. For with regard to morals, each man is so impressed with his own judgment that there would be found as many reformers as heads, if others, besides those whom God has has established as sovereigns over his people, or to whom he has given enough grace and zeal to be prophets, were permitted to try to change anything. And although my speculations pleased me greatly, I believe that others also had some that pleased them perhaps more. But as soon as I had acquired certain general notions about physics, and after beginning to test them on various particular questions, I had noticed where they might lead and how much they differed from the principles in use up to the present. I believe that I could not keep them hidden, much as we can, hidden without gravely sinning against the law that obliges us to procure so much as we can the general good of all men. For they have made me see that it is possible to attain knowledge which is very useful to life, and in place of that speculative philosophy that is taught in the schools, we can find a practical one, by which, because it knows the force and actions of fire, water, air, stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies that environ us, as distinctly as we know the different trades of our artisans, we can employ them in all their proper usage, and thus make ourselves like masters in possession of nature. This is desirable not only for the invention of an infinity of artifices, which would enable us to enjoy without any pain the fruits of the earth and all the commodities to be found there, but also and principally for the conversation of health, which is without doubt the primary good and the foundation of all other goods of life. For even the mind is so dependent on the temperament and on the disposition of the organs of the body, that if it is possible to find some means that generally renders men more wise and more capable than they have been up to now, I believe that we must seek for it in medicine. It is true that what is now practiced contains little whose utility is very remarkable, but although I have no intention of deprecating it, I am sure that there is nobody, even among those who make a profession of it, who does not admit that all we now know is almost nothing in comparison with what remains to be known, and that we could be spared an infinity of diseases of the body as well as the mind, and even also perhaps the enfeeblement of old age, if we had enough knowledge of their causes and of all the remedies which nature has provided us. And because I intended to use my whole life for the inquiry into such a necessary science, and had found a path by following which it seemed that I might infallibly find it, unless prevented by the brevity of my life or the lack of experience, I judged that there was no better remedy against these two impediments than to communicate faithfully to the public all the little that I had found, and to urge good minds to try to go further by contributing, each according to his inclination and power, to the experiments required, and also to communicate to the public everything that they had learned, in order that later men begin where their predecessors had arrived. Thus we all together would go much further, joining the lives and labors of many than each in particular could do. Interesting. So he was afraid to give his innermost thoughts, it sounds like, but felt that it was necessary for the conservation of health. And where are we? Where are we in that market, in that economy on health? Like a bunch of dope smokers. Excerpt from The Naturalist by E.O. Wilson. Now, E.O. Wilson, I read part of his book for a paper that I did on altruism. That's what it was on altruism. That's pretty good. The first 3 chapters of this memoir by the great contemporary entomologist Edward O. Wilson was from which the attached readings are drawn, relate the experiences he believes formed him as a man and specifically as a scientist. The first, Wilson's embrace of nature, occurred as he roamed free on the Gulf shore of Florida at age 7. How nice for all these men just to be, pocketing money and roaming the earth, isn't it? While we're trying to avoid prostitution and keep our families together and keep the drunkard from beating us. Not fully explains my experience. The second was his early education at a military academy. The third was his encounter with religious faith. Most people would call Wilson a scientist, and often in this book he calls himself one too. Yet the title of his memoir is Naturalist, and he begins it with his experiences at the ocean shore to illustrate how a naturalist is created. Wilson writes that his memoirs of that experience when he was 7 are built around a small collection of dominating images. These images are of creatures, monsters he found at the water's edge. In the beginning of what would become a lifelong passion for collecting, the young Wilson sought to capture these creatures, the better to behold them. Why in this chapter of Gathering and Gazing does Wilson say he is describing the creation of a naturalist? What is the difference between the boy's gaze at the impervious sea and the adult's gaze at insects, which can be taken apart and revealed? How much the injury done to his eyes by one of the creatures at which he is gazing have influenced his memories of the monsters he saw that summer, or of his subsequent views of nature? Wilson and Archimedes share a desire to gaze at the truth, yet how do their gazes differ? In the second chapter, a portion of which appears below, the now 8-year-old Wilson is sent to board for 1 year at the Gulf Coast Military Academy in Gulfport, Mississippi at 8. Although this marked the end of all dreams of language and boyhood adventure, he ultimately grew to love the academy for leaving him with images of a perfect orderliness and lofty purpose. As a result of the academy's training, Wilson developed an intense admiration for those who concentrate all the courage and self-discipline they possess toward a single worthy goal. Okay, so these are excerpts from The Naturalist. Is greatness in science dependent on or enhanced by devotion to perfect orderliness and lofty purpose? Is there any similarity between military self-discipline and the disciplines of scientific method? Are the outlooks and beliefs of the naturalist and the scientist the same? In the third chapter, part of which is attached here, Wilson describes how he was drawn to faith by the powerful Baptist service and by a pastor who tapped his sensitivity to patriotism and sacrifice. A grandmotherly woman further fired his religious imagination and hope with a story about a miracle. Yet even when that hope began to fade, Wilson's faith remained strong. It started to crack only at his baptism. The pastor smoked a cigar, and Wilson's immersion in the baptismal water felt totally physical and somewhat common. His growing enchantment with science completed the destruction of his faith, as the physical world increasingly seemed to me to be the complete world. Yet while he has lost his belief in God, he continues to believe in the religious experiences of men. For these, he now seeks a naturalistic explanation, one encompassing everything from atoms to genes to the human spirit. Wilson writes at the end of chapter the end of chapter 1, that when his sight and hearing were both diminished, the turning wheel of my life came to a halt, leaving him to celebrate that part of nature which can be brought close for inspection. For a man like Wilson, where might the wheel have stopped had these accidents not halted it when they did? Wilson attributes his admiration for scientists who work heroically to his education at the military academy. Can it also be understood in the light of his early impression that nature is a tensed malignity and the source of monsters? When Wilson became disappointed by religion and science replaced it for him as the light and the way, he sought a comprehensive scientific explanation for religion. How might the frustration of his religious hopes have enlarged his scientific quest? Does his science rest on something like a religious faith? Is such a faith in science rational? Is it reasonable? So now we start the Wilson writing. Paradise Beach. What we think happened in distant memory is built around a small collection of dominating images. In one of my own from the age of 7, I stand in shallows off Paradise Beach, staring down at a huge jellyfish in water so still and clear that its every detail is revealed as though it were trapped in glass. The creature is astonishing. It existed outside my previous imagination. I study it from every angle I can imagine from above the water's surface. Its opalescent pink bell is divided by thin red lines that radiate the center to circular edge. A wall of tentacles falls from the rim to surround and partially veil a feeding tube and other organs which fold in and out like the fabric of a drawn curtain. I can see only a little way into this lower tissue mass. I want to know more, but I am afraid to wade in deeper and look more closely into the heart of the creature. The jellyfish I know now, was a sea nettle, formal scientific name Chrysaora, Quinquecera, a scyphozoan medusa, a member of the pelagic fauna that drifted in from the Gulf of Mexico and paused in the place I found it. I had no idea then that these names from the lexicon of zoology, the only word I had heard was jellyfish. But what a spectacle my animal was, and how inadequate, how demeaning the bastard word used to label it. I should have been able to whisper its true name, Scyphozoan. Think of it. I have found a scyphozoan. The name would have been a more fitting monument to this discovery. The creature hung there, motionless for hours. An evening approached, and the time came for me to leave. Its tangled undermass appeared to stretch deeper into the darkening water. Was this, I wondered, an animal or a collection of animals? Today I can say that it was a single animal, and that another outwardly similar animal found in the same waters the Portuguese man of war is a colony of animals so tightly joined as to form one smoothly functioning superorganism. Such are the general facts I recite easily now, but this sea nettle was special. It came into my world abruptly from I knew not where, radiating what I cannot put into words except alien purpose and dark happenings in the kingdom of deep water. The scyphozoan still embodies, when I summon its image, all the mystery and tense malignity of the sea. The next morning, the sea nettle was gone. I never saw another during that summer of 1936. The place, Paradise Beach, which I have revisited in recent years, is a small settlement on the east shore of Florida's Perdido Bay, not far from Pensacola and in sight of Alabama across the water. There was trouble at home in this season of fantasy. My parents were ending their marriage that year. Existence was difficult for them, but not for me, their only child, and at least not yet. I had been placed in the care of a family that boarded one or two boys during the months of the summer vacation. Paradise Beach was a paradise truly named for a little boy. Each morning after breakfast, I left the small shorefront house to wander alone in search of treasures along the strand. I waded in and out of the dependably warm surf and scrounged for anything I could find in the drift. Sometimes I just sat on a rise to scan the open water, back in time for lunch, out again, back for dinner, out once again, and finally off to bed to relive my continuing adventure briefly before falling asleep. I have no remembrance of the names of the family I stayed with, what they looked like, their ages, or even how many there were. Most likely they were a married couple, and I am willing to suppose caring and warm-hearted people. They have passed out of my memory, and I have no need to learn their identity. It was the animals of that place that cast a lasting spell. I was 7 years old, and every species, large and small, was a wonder to be examined, thought about, and if possible, captured and examined again. There were nettlefish, foot-long green torpedoes with slender beaks, cruising the water just beneath the surface. Nervous in temperament, they kept you in sight and never let you come close enough to reach out a hand and catch them. I wonder where they went at night, but never found out. Blue crabs with skin-piercing claws scuttled close to the shore at dusk. Easily caught in long-handled nets, they were boiled and cracked open and eaten straight or added to gumbo, the spiced seafood stew of the Gulf Coast. Sea trout and other fish worked deeper work deeper water out to the nearby eelgrass flats and perhaps beyond. If you had a boat, you could cast for them and bait and spinners with bait and spinners. Stingrays carrying threatening lances of bone flat along their muscular tails buried themselves in the bottom sand of hip deep water in the daytime and moved close to the surface as darkness fell. How I longed to discover animals, each larger than the last, until finally I caught a glimpse of some true giant. I knew there were large animals out there in deep water. Occasionally a school of bottlenose porpoises passed offshore, less than a stone's throw from where I stood. In pairs, trios, and quartets, they cut the surface with their backs and dorsal fins arched down and out of sight, and broke the water again 10 or 20 yards farther on. Their repetitions were so rhythmic that I could pick the spot where they would appear next. On calm days, I sometimes scanned the grassy surface of Perdido Bay for hours at a time in the hope of spotting something huge and monstrous as it rose to the surface. I wanted at least to see a shark, to watch the fabled dorsal fin thrust proud out of the water, knowing it would look a lot like a porpoise at a distance, but would surface and sound at irregular intervals. I also hoped for more than sharks. What exactly I could not say, something to enchant the rest of my life. Almost all that came in sight were clearly porpoises, but I was not completely disappointed. Before I tell you about the one exception, let me say something about the psychology of monster hunting. Giants exist as a state of mind. They are defined not as an absolute measurement, but as a proportionality. I estimate that when I was 7 years old, I saw animals at about twice the size I see them now. The bell of a sea nettled averages 10 inches across. I know now, but the one I found seemed 2 feet across, a grown man's 2 feet. So giants can be real, even if adults don't choose to classify them as such. I was destined to meet such a creature at last, but it would not appear as a swirl on the surface of the open water. It came close and in at dusk, suddenly, as I sat on the dock leading away from the shore to the family boathouse raised on pilings and shallow water. In the failing light, I could barely see to the bottom, but I stayed perched on the dock anyway, looking for any creature, large or small, that might be moving. Without warning, a gigantic ray, many times larger than the stingrays of common experience, glided silently out into the darkness, beneath my dangling feet and away into the depths on the other side. It was gone in seconds, a circular shadow seeming to blanket the whole bottom. I was thunderstruck and immediately seized with the need to see this behemoth again. Behemoth. To capture it if I could and to examine it close up. Perhaps I thought it lived nearby and cruised around the dock every night. Late the next afternoon, I anchored a line on the dock, skewered a live pinfish on the biggest hook that I could find in the house, and let the bait sit in 6 feet of water overnight. The following morning, I rushed out and pulled in the line. The bait was gone, the hook was bare. I repeated the procedure for a week without result, always losing the pinfish. I might have had better luck in snagging a ray if I had used shrimp or crab for bait, but no one gave me this beginner's advice. One morning, I pulled in a Gulf toadfish, an omnivorous bottom dweller with a huge mouth, bulging eyes, and slimy skin. Locals considered the species a trash fish and one of the ugliest of all sea creatures. I thought it was wonderful. I kept my toadfish in a bottle for a day, then let it go. After a while, I stopped putting the line out for the great ray. I never again saw it pass beneath the dock. Why do I tell you this little boy's story of Medusa, rays, and sea monsters nearly 6 years after the fact? Because it illustrates, I think, how a naturalist is created. A child comes to the edge of deep water with a mind prepared for wonder. He is like a primitive adult of long ago, an acquisitive early homo arriving at the shore of Lake Malawi, say, or the Mozambique Channel. The experience must have been repeated countless times over thousands of generations, and it was richly rewarded. The sea, the lakes, and the broad rivers served as sources of food and barriers against enemies. No petty boundaries could split their flat expanse. They could not be burned or eroded like sterile gullies. They were impressive. It seemed to change. They were impressive. It seemed to change of any kind. The waterland was always there, timeless and vulnerable, mostly beyond reach and inexhaustible. The child is ready to grasp this archetype to explore and learn, but he has few words to describe his guiding emotions. Instead, he is given a compelling image that will serve in later life as a talisman, transmitting a powerful energy that directs the growth of experience and knowledge. He will add complicated details and context from his culture as he grows older, but the core image stays intact. When an adult, he will find it curious, if he is at all reflective, that he has the urge to travel all day to fish or to watch sunsets on the ocean horizon. Hands-on experience in the critical time, non-systematic knowledge is what counts in the making of a naturalist. Better to be an untutored savage for a while, not to know the names or anatomical detail. Better to spend long stretches of time just searching and dreaming. Rachel Carson, who understood this principle well, used different words to the same effect in The Sense of Wonder in 1965. If facts are the seeds that later produce knowledge and wisdom, then the emotions and the impressions of the senses are the fertile soil in which the seeds must grow. The years of childhood are the time to prepare the soil. She wisely took children to the edge of the sea. The summer at Paradise Beach was for me not an educational exercise planned by adults, but an accident in a haphazard life. I was parked there in what my parents trusted would be a safe and carefree environment. During that brief time, however, a second accident occurred that determined what kind of naturalist I would eventually become. I was fishing on the dock with minnow hooks and rod, jerking pinfish out of the water as soon as they struck the bait. The species, Lagodon rhomboides, is small, perch-like, and voracious. It carries 10 needle-like spines that stick straight up in the membranes of the dorsal fin when it is threatened. I carelessly yanked too hard when one of the fish pulled on my line. I flew it out of the water and into my face. One of the spines pierced the pupil of my right eye. The pain was excruciating and I suffered for hours. But being anxious to stay outdoors, I didn't complain very much. I continued fishing. Later, the host family, if they understood the problem at all, I can't remember, did not take me in for medical treatment. The next day, the pain had subsided and mild discomfort, and then it disappeared. Several months later, after I had returned home to Pensacola, the pupil of the eye began to cloud over with a traumatic cataract. As soon as my parents noticed the change, they took me to a doctor who shortly afterward admitted me to the old Pensacola hospital to have the lens removed. I was left with full sight in the left eye only. Fortunately, that vision proved to be more acute at close range than average, 2010 on the ophthalmologist chart, and it has remained so all my life. I lost stereoscopy, but can make out fine print and the hairs on the bodies of small insects. In adolescence, I also lost, possibly as a result of a hereditary defect, most of my hearing in the uppermost registers. Without a hearing aid, I cannot make out the calls of many bird and frog species. So when I set out later as a teen with Roger Torrey Peterson's field guide to the birds and binoculars in hand, as all true naturalists in America must at one time or other, I proved to be a wretched bird watcher. I couldn't hear birds. I couldn't locate them unless they obligingly fluttered past in clear view. Even one bird singing in a tree close by was invisible unless someone pointed a finger straight at it. The same was true of frogs. On rainy spring nights, my college companions could walk to the mating grounds of frogs, guided only by the high-pitched calls of the males. I managed a few, such as the deep-voiced barking tree frog, which sounds like someone thumping a tub, and the eastern spadefoot toad, which wails like a soul on its way to perdition. But for most species, all I detected was a vague buzzing in the ears. In one important respect, the turning wheel of my life came to a halt at this very early age. I was destined to become an entomologist, committed to minute crawling and flying insects, not by any touch of idiosyncratic genius, not by foresight, but by a fortuitous constriction of physiological ability. I had to have one kind of animal, if not another, because the fire had been lit and I took what I could get. The attention of my surviving eye turned to the ground. I would therefore celebrate the little things of the world, the animals that can be picked up between thumb and forefinger and brought close for inspection. Okay, well, we have quite a bit more to go in The Naturalist. So I'm going to stop there. We've been reading for 45 minutes. So yeah, I'm going to stop there, and we will continue with section number 2 of The Naturalist by E.O. Wilson, called Send Us the Boy. Thanks so much for joining me here in the reading room, where we are reading the book Being Human, Core Readings in the Humanities. This is the textbook if you were to take a college course in humanities. One of the things that we're not doing is answering those questions, but the humanities course didn't answer them either, which I found a little bit useless, frivolous. I don't know what the right word is there. This is day 6 of reading Being Human, Core Readings in Humanities in the reading room. Remember, we're still on section 1, which is Natural Imperfection and Human Longing. This is chapter 2. So section 1 of the book, chapter 2, Scientific Aspirations. We read Discourse on Method by Rene Descartes today, and the first section of an excerpt from E.O. Wilson, Edward O. Wilson, The Naturalist. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. It is May 20th. It is day 350 in the classroom. I'm the teacher, always bringing you some information that helps grow your mind, your body, and your spirit in healthier ways. Thanks so much for joining me.